Hey everybody, got a quick announcement before we get into the episode. Starting next month, we're going to change the way we release French Friday episodes. So the French Friday at the end of March is only going to be released exclusively on the SkyePod podcast feed. It's no longer going to be available on the regular Holy Post feed. So that means you're going to want to go to wherever you get your podcasts and sign up for the SkyePod feed. You subscribe to that and you don't have to worry about missing a future French Friday. Now, one other note. Normally, we only release about half of every SkyePod episode for everybody to listen to for free, and the full episodes are exclusively for Holy Post Plus subscribers. But don't worry, French Friday episodes are going to be different. Every month on the SkyePod feed, French Friday will be available in its entirety to everyone, even if you're not a Holy Post Plus subscriber. So if you haven't already signed up to follow the SkyePod on whatever platform you get your podcasts, you should do that right now so that you don't miss next month's French Friday. In fact, do it right now. Pause this episode and go to your app, wherever you get your podcasts, look for the SkyePod and hit subscribe. I'll wait for you. Go do that right now. Okay, good job. You're all set. You don't have to worry about it. You'll get the French Friday in its entirety next month. And on Fridays, you can listen to whatever part of the SkyePod episodes you want. And if you love it, you can join Holy Post Plus and get the full thing. Thanks for doing that. Now let's get on with the show.
Guess what day it is?
Oh,
It's French Friday, it's French Friday, so grab your fries and say hooray! David French is here to play on French Friday. It's French Friday.
David French, good to see you.
Skye, great to see you.
Okay, so let's kick off. I don't want to pretend like this is a news program where people are going to get their information. They have other sources for that, including the good work you do at the New York Times and your other colleagues over at the Dispatch. There's lots of places that get that. But in order to begin our conversation today, can we just kind of cover the waterfront briefly on the major moves that the Trump administration has made since our last conversation? We don't have to pick apart all the implications of these moves yet, but what have been, I don't know if they're highlights or lowlights, domestically and in foreign policy. What has caught your attention?
Well, easily the biggest thing that has caught my attention is the reversal on Ukraine.
Right.
I mean, this is, back, Skye, in the election season, we had a conversation talking about like why I voted for Kamala Harris for the first time, voting for a Democrat for president for the first time in my life. In 2016 and 2020, I'd voted third party. And I brought this up and I said that, look, historians looking back at this race 100 years from now, we know there is one issue that they will be focusing on. 100 years from now, people will be talking about the Ukraine war. And I said, although I have my problems with the way the Biden administration has handled the war, I think that aid was too little, often too slow, often, but they're backing Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
And everything that I can tell from Trump is that he will not. Well, I was pessimistic about Trump in Ukraine. I was not pessimistic enough because what appears to have happened is, for all intents and purposes, he appears to have switched sides. He sided with Russia and North Korea, two of the combatants in the war against Ukraine, because North Korea has sent troops, in a vote in the UN. He has extorted a minerals deal from Ukraine that it's very unclear what that does to help Ukraine in any way, shape, or form. In many circles, he's already begun negotiations with Russia without Ukraine present. Many of his officials appear to have already conceded key points to Russia without asking for any concessions from Russia in return. It's just entirely fair and accurate at this point to say that it looks, on balance, the United States has switched sides to join with and serve the interests of the aggressor in this conflict, Russia.
Yeah, and one thing to keep in mind here is when we look at it from an American point of view, we think, well, there was a change in administration, there's a new president, all that. But from an international point of view, from an outsider's point of view, forget administration or who's in the White House. The United States made a commitment to Ukraine. The Congress passed bills to support Ukraine, and both militarily, financially, in multiple ways. So you can say, well, there's a new president, so there's a new policy, but it's not a new country. We don't have a new regime, as they put it. Like, it's not a completely new government here. We made commitments to an ally, and in the course of a few weeks, we, the United States, have rescinded that commitment. We have broken that commitment. And not only have we denied help that we promised to our ally, we have thrown in our lot with the enemy, which is, I can't think of another time in American history where anything close to this has ever happened.
I cannot come up with an example. And Skye, I'm so glad you put this in the greater context, because if you think back to the Cold War, there were lots of differences between Democrats and Republicans in the Cold War. As a general matter, with Republicans in the Cold War, you were looking at a little bit more defense spending, for example. You were looking at maybe a little bit more aggressive in approach to Soviet client states overseas. I mean, but these were matters of degree, not kind. So at no point when you're having a Cold War era election was the question, are we going to be on the side of, say, Britain and France, or are we going to be on the side of the Soviet Union? That was not a question.
Right.
We were with our allies, Britain and France. We were with our ally, West Germany. We were with our allies. And the question was, what tactics would we pursue? How much money would we expend? This is something very different. This is a new administration, means a complete 180 reversal in policy. And what's important about this, Skye, it's not just important for the facts on the ground in Ukraine, as terrible as that could get. It's important because you cannot unring this bell.
Right.
Our European partners now know that we could bail on them at any moment. And that changes the calculus internationally, and it will change the calculus for a generation internationally.
It is remarkable that we have spent 80 years since World War II creating a network of alliances around the world that have more or less held because of American faithfulness. And in the course of just a few weeks, it is completely undone.
Totally.
It's absolutely stunning. And I mean, we could just talk about Ukraine the whole time, but it fits into a larger framework of how Trump operates. We had made commitments for at least since the 1960s to a two-state solution in Israel and with the Palestinians. Well, that's gone under the Trump administration. And he's posting ridiculous things about what he wants to do with Gaza to make it into some kind of resort casino shrine to himself. I mean, the images are crazy. And even domestically, he has dismantled the Department of Justice by what he's done with Eric Adams in New York. And he's fired a bunch of commanders from the Pentagon in a purge. And it appears that, and you've written about this, it appears that these firings are not with cause. It's not because they were insubordinate. It wasn't because they were failing in some critical mission. It was because he doesn't like the fact that there were people of color or women in some of these positions. And the assumption is that they must have been given those positions because of DEI, not because of merit, or others who are in positions of leadership in the Pentagon who he didn't think were sufficiently loyal to him. I mean, it's just stunning the way that this is operating. And it's a dramatic change from his first term in office. How do you account for that change? I'm sure a lot of people voted for Trump in 2024 thinking, well, we've had him before. It was bad. It wasn't that bad. But in 1 month, it's really bad. So why is it so different?
Well, there's that old saying, personnel is policy. And so if you look at Trump 1.0, who surrounded him when he started his presidency? General Mattis, a person of extreme integrity and stature. I didn't necessarily love the Rex Tillerson pick for Secretary of State, but he was a very serious man. Mm-hmm. If you go down the line of a lot of his cabinet picks, by and large, they were serious people. They were people who had considerable international experience. H.R. McMaster is National Security Advisor, one of the most respected generals in the military. You could just go down the line. Well, now what do we have? Hegseth, Kash Patel, Dan Bongino, even the serious people like Marco Rubio. He's not behaving in a serious fashion. Right. You cannot behave in a serious fashion and remain in good standing in this administration. And what happened slowly over time, Skye, is that Trump began to feel more self-confident in being president. He got more angry at the people who were telling him no. That by the end of his presidency, you actually began to see the real Trump. So the real Trump you began to see by the end of his presidency. So all those people who are like 2017 to 2019, that's the Trump I want. Well, He was gone by 2020. You know, when the George Floyd riots broke out, when COVID happened, when he lost the election, you began to see the true colors. And this is where his tensions with the military really picked up. Because he was suggesting, for example, shooting protesters in the legs. He was suggesting, for example, shooting unarmed migrants in the legs as they try to cross the Rio Grande. He was engaging in, he tried to, in the very last weeks of his presidency, yank all the troops out of Afghanistan, parts of Africa, Germany. I mean, just wild, wild stuff. And consistently, there were the few remaining sort of establishment figures in the administration were throwing their bodies in front of all of this. Just no, it cannot happen. None of those voices are present anymore. None of them. And this is by design. And so he is absolutely, I mean, this is what we're experiencing now is the Donald Trump that kept trying to peak out in much of the first term and really came to the fore in 2020. But it's that personnel issue. They're gone are the people who will throw their bodies in front of bad policies. All you have now are sycophants and enablers.
Okay, so we are 1 month into this term, and by my calculation, we have about 47 more to go. So it's going to be a long ride, and hopefully it's over after this second term, but who knows? He says that, you can't break the law if you're trying to save your country. So maybe, and there's all the constitutional stuff we've talked about before. But ever since Trump appeared on the scene back in 2015 and 2016, there have been various attempts to try to create what we'll call, for lack of a better term, a unified theory of Trump. What is it that explains how he operates, his decisions on the international stage, his staffing decisions, all that? And I mean, early on, there was a conspiracy theory of sorts that the Russians had compromat on him, like compromising material, which is why he was always seeming to defer to Putin's wishes. And that all blew up during the Russiagate fiasco in his first term, and there wasn't quite the evidence that people were hoping for to prove that theory. Then there's the isolationist Trump theory that he just wants to do what's right for America and he doesn't care about international relations. I said, well, that doesn't exactly hold up either, because he's also saying he wants to annex Greenland and take back the Panama Canal. That's not exactly an isolationist posture. So there's been these various theories, and Jonathan Rouch just wrote a piece for The Atlantic that presents another one. And this is one that I find somewhat compelling. It might work. So I want to talk about it a little bit. He has a piece that we'll post in the show notes titled "One Word Describes Trump." There are many words that may come to our minds, but the one he wants us to think of is patrimonialism. So I assume you've read the article, and there's other words we could substitute for that, but describe what is patrimonialism, and in what ways do you think that accurately describes the way Trump thinks and operates, both domestically and on the world stage?
Yeah, here's the great quote from the piece, that the default form of rule in the pre-modern world was this patrimonialism, where the state was little more than the extended household of the ruler. It didn't exist as a separate entity. In other words, a best way to say it is to use the words of the Sun King, "L'État c'est moi," the state is me. And so that the state he is the state is an extension of him. And, I found that really interesting and compelling. And it actually also matches with, I think, the way in which he thinks of world leaders like a Vladimir Putin, like a Xi Jinping, because I think to really understand Trump and how Trump sees his place in the world is he sees himself as a peer of Putin and Xi Jinping, not of, say, the Western prime ministers or presidents or allies. They're not, they're vassals, they're subordinates. His real peers are Putin, Xi Jinping. And that you really do see elements of that kind of pre-modern patrimonialism, this sort of idea that I am an extension of the state. That's one of the reasons why I think the better comparison of Putin isn't to the Soviet Union, but to the Russian Empire and the czars. Right. And I think he sees himself much more in that as well. He thinks that the USSR was a mistake, for example. But this idea that he embodies the government, he embodies the people, you hear that very consistently, and you hear that very consistently from people around him. When you hear Elon Musk talk, when you hear others talk at CPAC, for example, they're placing an enormous amount of emphasis on sort of Trump as the embodiment of the Constitution even.
Yeah. Didn't this kind of come out explicitly recently? There was a meeting of governors at the White House, and I forget who, maybe the governor of Maine. Somebody expressed a commitment to follow the law or to follow the Constitution and whatever the president had been saying at the time. And he responded by saying, was it, "I am the law" or "I am the Constitution"? Something like that. I forget the exact quote, but it was really creepy.
Yeah, it was creepy because and what you're beginning to see is this move in the Trump world to essentially to change the terms of the American Social Compact.
Right.
So if you go back to the American founding, I've described in a course recently, the American founding as sort of having the first founding, not the second founding is similar pattern, but here let's talk about the first founding. And that's the 1787 Constitution, Revolution, et cetera. It had three distinct sort of conceptual stages. Stage one would have been Declaration of Principle, and that's the Declaration of Independence. These are the principles. Then you have the codification of the principles in the Constitution. And then you have the judicial affirmation of the structure of government in Marbury versus Madison, which is, to me, you can't really complete the founding cycle, which includes the Declaration, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, without Marbury versus Madison.
Okay, for those who aren't familiar or they forgot from high school history class, Marbury versus Madison is a very early Supreme Court ruling that essentially granted or affirmed that the courts had the right of judicial review. In other words,
right,
the court is the final arbiter on what is constitutional.
Correct. The court tells both branches of government, both the president and the legislature, what the Constitution means.
So if there's a disagreement,
exactly,
they're the final judge, literally.
They're the final arbiter.
Right.
They can disagree. So it's not that the president or the Congress has no role in interpreting the Constitution. They should be only proposing, for example, legislation they believe to be constitutional. President should only be issuing executive orders that he believes to be constitutional. So it's not that they have no role, but the final arbiter is the court.
Right.
And the court is the final arbiter over legislation. The court is also the final arbiter over executive actions. And this is where I'm getting very, very worried about the future of rule of law. If you're talking about a Russ Vought and some of the others, Russ Vought being the head of OMB, Office of Management and Budget, very influential in Trump world, they don't like this precedent. They don't like this. And Vought has said we need to sweep away 200 years worth of precedent. And so you're in a situation where they want to change the role of the president in America's constitutional government to put the president front and center, the tip of the spear, the apex, the pinnacle of power. They want it to be the president of the United States. Now, what's so weird about this guy, this is actually really self-defeating if you believe that we're going to have a functioning democracy going forward, because all of the power and authority you give to Donald Trump now will be in the hands of the next Democratic president.
Well, that's assuming they think there's going to be a next Democratic president.
These guys, I think, are really so drunk on their own Kool-Aid right now that they think they've accomplished some sort of permanent realignment. I think that they really believe that they have permanently crushed their enemies and that they will be the ones wielding all of this power now and into the future. And that's just, I mean, if modern American history teaches us anything, is that triumphalism has a shelf life of about 5 or 6 months before it becomes pretty clear that backlashes are brewing.
No one's denying, to my knowledge, that Donald Trump legitimately won this election, and he won the majority of the vote. But it was not a decisive victory. It was not.
No.
Compared to other presidential elections in our lifetime, this was a very narrow win. It's hard to say that they've permanently realigned American politics and permanently defeated their progressive enemies. It's ridiculous. We've seen this go back and forth for 20 years now.
Oh, it's so funny. Skye, the other day I was doing some research to talk about how irrational all this triumphalism was. And if you go back the last 20 years, the triumphalist rhetoric from Republicans and Democrats is laugh out loud funny. So in 2004, you had a number of people who are saying the Republicans are about to have a generational majority. They called a generational change, or sometimes they are even saying permanent majority. Mm-hmm. They lost the House in 2006. Okay. So then 2008 rolls around and Obama wins a much bigger victory than Trump won, much bigger victory than Trump won in 2016 or 2024. There's this sort of sense that the Democrats after 2006 and 2008 have really cracked the code, and then they get routed in 2010. Republicans get all excited, lose in 20. I mean, you just go back and forth. It's absolutely amazing.
Okay, I agree, but let me perhaps give a devil's advocate response. If I were one of these MAGA people, drunk on my own Kool-Aid, as you put it, and I look at this last election and how it's different from what we've seen in the last 20 years, here's what would come to mind. We have a guy who was impeached for trying to squeeze a foreign leader to do his political dirty work. We have a president who was impeached a second time for inciting a riot, trying to overthrow a legitimate election in which there was a violent assault on the Capitol, including calls to execute his own vice president. We have a president that has violated norm after norm after norm and has broken every convention of the American presidency imaginable. We have a guy who was indicted, 93 times and actually found liable for sexual assault. We have somebody who has just broken everything imaginable in the American political system and yet still won the popular vote after all of that in 2024. Isn't that to be taken as the American people are saying, we want this guy so badly that we will look past all of those things because this is the realignment we really want? Like, I don't see Barack Obama surviving that kind of behavior and double impeachment, everything else, and getting reelected in 2012. There's no way. So I can understand why the MAGA faithful would look at this and go, well, and we're not even counting the ridiculous stuff around God's protection of him in the assassination attempt in Pennsylvania back in the summer in July. Like, they look at all of that and go, well, clearly not only is God on Trump's side, but the people want him because they've thrown everything you possibly can to destroy this man's political ambitions, and he keeps coming back.
There is no argument from me that Donald Trump has a unusual cult of personality around him. Yeah. You're not going to get any argument from me. But where is the evidence that all of that loyalty extends to wider MAGA, which is that if you're going to have a permanent realignment, if you're going to have a generational change, you by definition, you can't center it around a second-term president who's not eligible to run again. You're going to have to show that there is a generational change of some serious sort here. And look, the argument that Barack Obama had for generational change was much stronger than MAGA had. He won 2 victories by greater margins, for example, than MAGA has. And so, but we have seen this. We haven't seen specifically the Trump zealot, the Trump fanaticism, but we have seen political parties attach themselves to unique personalities and overread the generational effect of the attachment to the personality. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that a mistake the Democrats made is they took the fact that Barack Obama, the nation's first black president, got historic levels of minority support and said, oh, that's how minority voters will support Democrats. No, that's how they supported Barack Obama. Mm-hmm. And if you had a larger historical look, you would remember that in 2004, George W. Bush won about 40% or around 40% of the Hispanic vote in 2004. So it is not the case that Hispanics are always and everywhere going to be supermajority for Democrats. They were very much for Barack Obama. And we've seen this, say, for example, with Bill Clinton. A lot of people thought, well, we have a formula now with Bill Clinton. No, Bill Clinton had a particular appeal, similar to
Al Gore
Ronald
did
Reagan.
not, obviously.
And Al Gore did not.
Yeah.
And so you can do this again and again, that there are political figures who right now, and the reason why I think MAGA will actually have less legs in many ways than some of the, so after Reagan left, Reaganite republicanism had legs for a while after that. But one of the reasons why I think MAGA will have less legs is because MAGA is so tied to the person of Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. That is the only thing unifying this movement. It is, if you're going to have super pro-choice, anti-vax liberals who love Robert F. Kennedy, and you're going to have Christian nationalists in the same tent, the only thing keeping them together right now is the person of Donald Trump. Agreed. There isn't a natural ideological alignment here at all. And so I think Republicans will find in relatively short order that either when Trump leaves the scene or if Trump's sort of Teflon starts to fray, they'll be shocked. They'll be shocked at how impermanent their permanent majority is.
Okay, so that analysis fits with what Jonathan Rouch is arguing in his piece about patrimonialism. This notion that a government is all about allegiance to and loyalty to the father figure, to the head of the household. And he makes a parallel to the structure of mafia bosses. This is exactly how the mob works. There's a godfather. And people who've seen all the movies know how this works. It's about loyalty to that figure. And it begins to make sense then of how Trump is operating both domestically and around the world. So at one point, Rouch says that patrimonialism's antithesis is not democracy, it's bureaucracy. And you mentioned this in Trump's first term. He kept bumping up against the bureaucracy of the government and people within that bureaucracy that refused to do his bidding, that were throwing their bodies down in front of his worst instincts to remove troops from all over the world and to shoot protesters in American cities and to unleash violence against people seeking asylum on the border or whatever. So the bureaucracy was against him. But now in his second term, Trump's figured this out, and he's remaking the government bureaucracy into this patrimonial structure where it isn't proficiency or experience or wisdom or even congressional approval that gets you appointed anymore. It's personal loyalty to Donald Trump. We still can't figure out who gave the authority beyond the president to Elon Musk to do his Doge stuff. And the courts are wrestling with that now, but it's personal loyalty to Donald Trump. And it also makes sense then in his actions overseas. And Rouch gets into this, and I think Jonah Goldberg and others have talked about how when you look at what Trump's doing on the international stage, it's almost like he's gathering the five families. And he's the head of one family, Putin's the head of another, Xi's the head of another, and they're looking at the world and going, okay, you've got your territory, I've got my territory. And the attitude is essentially, well, yeah, the U.S. shouldn't be doing anything in Ukraine because that's Putin's territory. And as the boss, he should be able to do whatever he wants in his territory. And Trump's looking at North America or the Western Hemisphere and going, well, Greenland, that's my territory. And Panama, that's my territory.
Canada, Mexico.
Right. I should be able to do whatever I want there. And for the first time, I feel like there's an explanatory system that makes consistent sense of how Trump operates. He's a mob boss. And he sees the world as being run by mob bosses. And the great enemy then is anyone who is looking for a principled bureaucratic system that stands on the rule of law rather than the personal whims of the Godfather. Do you see any cracks in that explanation? Is there something that it doesn't explain in Trump?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I do think I would say it is the most powerful explanatory it's the most powerful explanatory concept that I've heard so far. I don't think anything explains him necessarily perfectly because there are some very small common ideological threads to MAGA, one of them being tariffs, another one being immigration restriction. But as a general matter, you're talking about a movement that isn't really ideological.
Right.
Which is why it makes me laugh when people will say that I'm not really conservative for not supporting Trump. There's no ideology behind Trumpism, really. There is this sort of sense of ego and power that manifests itself in very consistent ways, and it manifests itself in this friend-enemy distinction of political activity, and it manifests itself in this sort of sphere of influence and sphere of authority kind of foreign policy, because I think we now see that it isn't really isolationist.
No.
because we're trying to put an ideological frame around a collection of events that maybe the ideological frame doesn't matter. It's not isolationist to say, I want to take Greenland. I mean, that's not, what is that? That's aggressive. That's expansionist. That's not isolationist. It's not isolationist to say Canada should be our 51st state. That's expansionist. But it's all in line with this sort of, the best way, I keep thinking one of the best ways to analyze Donald Trump is to ask, what would Vladimir Putin do? Right. And I'm not kidding.
Yeah.
You know, and when it comes to how does Vladimir Putin view the world, he looks at his near abroad, these countries that are in the near orbit around Russia, and essentially says, I am entitled to dictate terms to these countries. These countries are essentially my vassals. And similarly, this is a why you're beginning to see some rumblings even on the Trump right, which has long prided itself on being, they say, we're not weak against our enemies, we're just stronger against China. We realize that China is more of a threat than Russia. But this mindset would throw Taiwan overboard.
Totally.
Instantaneously.
Right.
Because Taiwan is the near abroad to China. It's in the sphere of influence of China. And if I'm the Philippines, I'm not looking to Donald Trump. If I'm Japan, I'm not looking to Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And so
I think this.
Yeah, I think it's very consistent.
I think it also explains some of it, and we've done some work on this here at the Holy Post about the rejection of foreign aid and the end of USAID. And, you know, it's always presented as, well, there's fraud and abuse, or we want to put America first, and why are we sending money overseas? But I think, again, through this lens of patrimonialism, of this mob boss lens, the attitude is a little bit, well, why am I, Donald Trump, giving aid to hungry people in Sudan? That's not my territory. They can't do anything for me. There's no reciprocation there. What's the point of that? And so he just doesn't see the value in it, which is why so many of our international loyalties and allegiances, he's fine getting rid of, because it doesn't serve his personal interests.
Yeah, he looks at an alliance as a protection racket.
Exactly.
Not as a partnership. So this is when he constantly says, well, NATO hasn't paid up, as if NATO is sort of paying us something. No, this is how he constantly talks about NATO like it's a dues-paying club.
Right.
And that you only get American participation if America gets your dues. And that's a protection racket. That's not an alliance. And so again, when you think of it in those terms, a lot of how he processes the world makes much more sense.
Okay, I want to pivot to then how Christians think about this. And one of the other benefits, and Rouch doesn't talk about it in his piece, but when I read it, it helped me also make sense of perhaps why, at least in part, why so many white evangelicals find Trump's form of leadership appealing. And I think part of it's because so many of our churches, especially megachurches, operate this way. They're really systems of patrimonialism where it's all about this usually male figurehead, and the church is a system that orbits around him. And that even finds some, not justification, but some reflection in Scripture, because as Rouch talks about and others, the current form, the modern form of bureaucratic kind of law-based government is fairly recent. Most of world history has been patrimonialism. Caesar was the head of the giant household of the Roman Empire. Herod was the head of a household, governing Judea. There's that model of strongman identity that permeates the ancient world. And so you read parts of the Bible and you go, yeah, this is how it's supposed to be. And then unthoughtful, uncritical Christians read the Bible and they look at their church structures and their pastor at the top of this hierarchy, and they go, yeah, this is how the world's supposed to operate. And of course, I want a president that operates that way too. But they're ignoring thousands of years of cultural formation that has been guided by Christian values and principles. Which then takes us to something that you've written about and talked about, and that's this really remarkable book by Jeffrey Rosen called The Pursuit of Happiness. That phrase comes from the Declaration of Independence, and Rosen investigated, what did the founders mean by that? And I'd love for you to begin to kind of channel Rosen to us and help us understand why Trump's form of leadership, or even the highly patriarchal mobster kind of form of leadership, is antithetical to what the founders of this country wanted.
Right. Really does connect. And you noted this to an extent, Skye. It really does connect with kind of our human nature, with sort of the darker parts of our human nature, that we do look for that big leader. We do look for that strong person to rescue us. We do tend to adopt friend-enemy distinctions when we're talking about politics. All of this kind of comes naturally to us.
You see this, sorry to interrupt, but you see this in the Old Testament when Israel goes to the Lord and says, we don't want you as our king anymore. We want a king like all the other nations. And he's like, you don't want to do this. It's not going to go well. It's going to end in slavery and abuse and corruption. And he's like, all right, but if that's what you want, here. And they pick Saul, the biggest, strongest guy in town, and make him king. It's exactly our human nature to do this. And God warns us, this is not a good way to run a society.
Yeah. When you feel distress, give us a savior, give us a king.
Right.
I mean, and it's a common phenomenon in American history. Southern populism, for example, is very much centered around the man on the white horse who's going to rescue his people from the outsider attacks. And, that was a big part of the resistance to the civil rights movement, was this Southern populism, the man in the schoolhouse door who was standing in for you. That was an element of Southern populism. This sort of the great man is going to stand up for his people, not the people, his people. And so what the founders were wrestling with was they understood very well what human beings were like. Madison wrote it, if men were angels, there would be no need for government to rule over them, for example. So they knew very well that we were prone to demagogues. We're vulnerable to them. And so at the same time that they are creating a government of a limited government and protecting individual liberty, they were at the same time advocating for personal virtue and character. And that brings us to that book, The Pursuit of Happiness, by my friend Jeff Rosen. And he's saying that phrase, the pursuit of happiness, has been misunderstood for a very long time as sort of the pursuit of pleasure.
Right.
And he said, no. The way they understood the pursuit of happiness was as the pursuit of virtue. This was the core of the pursuit of happiness, was the pursuit of virtue. And they also knew that absent the pursuit of virtue, this constitutional republic was going to be in a perilous state. So John Adams, writes in 1800 that, without morality, without religion, human vices like avarice and greed, et cetera, would cut, and this was the quote, to cut through the cords of our constitution like a whale goes through a net. And so the founders knew that they were asking something of the people, that they were asking something. This would only work, this experiment only works if the people, not perfectly, because of course people are not perfect, if the people and the leaders pursue virtue.
Right. This is why
pursuit of virtue.
Benjamin Franklin famously said when he came out from the Constitutional Convention and was asked, what kind of government do we have? He says, a republic, if you can keep it. There was an expectation that the people had some responsibility to maintain the system through their virtue.
Exactly. And so what the book does is it really walks through how the founders, what was their vision of this? How did they put this into practice? And some of the parts that are interesting is you find out that some of the founders created a very personal inventory where they would list virtues like temperance, prudence, chastity, humility, honesty, fidelity, and literally keep a diary on how well they were living up to these virtues. And the precise list of virtues would change. They might be Aristotelian virtues, or they might be virtues more rooted in, say, the fruit of the Spirit, for example. But there was this concept that the pursuit of virtue is core to the enterprise of this nation, and that it's core to the structure of the nation. It's core to the identity of the nation. And the absence of virtue places the entire American social compact in jeopardy. And so when you look at it like that, from the very founding of the country, character was never a luxury. Character was always a necessity.
So this then intersects with another book I'm reading right now, and I know you've read, by Jonathan Rouch again, the guy who wrote the Atlantic article I was referencing. It's called Cross Purposes, and it's we're going to have him on the show soon, but his essential argument is that in order for American democracy to thrive, Christianity needs to thrive. And he juxtaposes what he calls thin Christianity and thick Christianity. Thin meaning it's informal, it's not serious, it doesn't really follow the teachings of Jesus with any rigor. And I'm partway through the book, and I've heard him talk about it in other places. But when I put that together with what I've heard you say from Jeffrey Rosen's book about the pursuit of happiness and how the founders understood these things, is it possible to put forward the hypothesis that the weakness/failure we are currently seeing in the American Republic in no small measure is the result of the failure and weakness of the American church to actually make disciples of Jesus?
Oh, yeah. I mean, Skye, it's grim. It's grim. I mean, think about this. If you look at the current presidency, it is in power because 82% of white evangelicals, self-described white evangelicals, voted for him. That is a super majority beyond a super majority. 82% of white evangelicals voted for him, self-described. If you look at everyone else, they rejected Trump 58% to 40%. So everyone else, that includes Black Christians, non-white Christians, non-white evangelicals, everyone else, 58 to 40 against him. The Donald Trump presidency is in a very concrete, tangible way the white evangelical church's delivery to America. This is all of this is we're getting this, not exclusively, but in large part because this is what the church has said that they're going to give America, which the white evangelical church has said they're going to. And there's just no way around that. There's no two ways about it. So when you're hearing stories like Andrew Tate, the pornographer who is accused of rape and sex trafficking, is now being allowed to come to the United States after American diplomatic pressure. That is what the church has done. That's what the church has done. And it's done it in part because a large segment of American Christians don't just reject the idea that character is a necessary element of leadership. They scorn it. They mock it. And that is something that would shock the founders, shock them.
Absolutely. Now, obviously, I don't think there are a ton of American churches or evangelical churches, if you want to be more specific, that are outright saying we want a mob boss in the presidency and we want people accused of sex trafficking and pornography to be set, all those graphic and awful values. No churches are standing up and advocating for those things. But what is going on is we have a lot of churches that are structured in a way that aren't actually incentivized to make people obedient followers of Jesus Christ. And instead, they're incentivized to attract an audience, to make sure they're coming on Sunday, to make sure they're happy and entertained, to make sure they're putting money in the offering. And if that doesn't actually result in forming people to be disciples of Jesus, that's right. I've been a consultant. I've talked to churches and I've flat out said to them at times, look, people who come to your church who are not meeting Jesus and who are not being formed in the gospel, they don't need to meet Jesus or be formed in the gospel for your church to survive. But if they don't put money in the plate, your church won't survive. So at the end of the day, the consumer ethic that drives so much of American culture also drives a lot of the American church. And so a lot of the segments of American evangelicalism have just abandoned the primary calling to make disciples. And in the vacuum, these people are having their values and lives shaped by things other than the scriptures or other than the gospel, other than Christ. They're being shaped by their news consumption, by social media consumption, by their political allegiances. And the failure of the church is now being seen in our politics. It's being seen by the people of Ukraine, for goodness sake.
Yeah,
that we're
horrible.
Okay turning our back on an ally that was invaded by an aggressor. And where's the outrage? Where's the church rising up and saying, no, absolutely not. We will not allow this to happen. Or the foreign aid, or you pick your topic, or the demonization of immigrants and refugees.
An aggressor that, by the way, brutally suppresses evangelicalism.
Right.
I mean, this is what's wild about it. It's not just any aggressor. It's a Russian aggressor that brutally represses religious freedom, for example.
Right. So to get on my soapbox for a second here, but part of my issue is I've talked to so many church leaders that have looked over the last 10 years at what's happened in America, and they kind of just wring their hands going, isn't it terrible? I can't believe this is happening. It's so stressful. And I don't know how to, not upset people in my church by talking about these things or not talking about these things. And they're taking a posture of the church is a poor victim of these terrible cultural currents that are going on. And I want to take them by the shoulders and shake them and go, we have done this. This is the fruit of our failure to actually take seriously our calling to make disciples. We have to change something. It's on the church to change something, not the world.
And it's also, how do we orient our disciples that we're making? What are we discipling them in this sort of, and I've put it like this, the longer we walk through this moment, the more I realize what we are dealing with is the fruit of a kind of Christianity that really has been taught in evangelical churches for 30, 40 plus years.
Absolutely.
And that is fight the world Christianity versus love your neighbor Christianity.
Yes.
So this is how, if you come up from the beginning to sort of say, you need to get ready for the coming persecution, you need to know that the world hates you, you need to put on the full armor of God in the sense of like getting ready for culture war, what that's created is a kind of fight or flight church where everyone is alert for danger, alert for persecution, alert for oppression. And so then what does that do? What that does is it creates that friend-enemy distinction that is antithetical to Scripture. And so it creates this friend-enemy distinction. And at the end of the day, you begin to get to this point where, for example, empathy is beginning to leave the church. There's actual attacks on empathy as a concept.
It's a sin now.
Because how dare you try to manipulate us by exposing us to the suffering of other people that we might be causing? What on earth are we talking about here? But that's the fight the world Christianity. And so when fight the world Christianity meets the ultimate pugilist in Donald Trump, then like calls out to like. And that's how you see that bond that is created when fight the world Christianity meets the ultimate political fighter in Donald Trump.
So my read, though, is in order to begin to shift this dynamic, it's going to take the courage of church leaders to say, I fear God more than I fear the audience, more than I fear the people. I am willing, if necessary, to sacrifice my job, my paycheck from my church in order to actually make disciples of Jesus rather than just keep people entertained and comfortable in my church. And I know there are good, faithful church leaders who are doing this. It's not universal.
Yes, there are.
There absolutely are. And I know many of them. But in aggregate, it's not working. We have populated the American church with people who are cowardly in their leadership and who won't do what's necessary or right, or aren't willing to sacrifice the well-being of their 501c3 nonprofit in order to actually pursue the kingdom of God. And we're seeing the fruit of that. And that's the part that I keep going back to thinking, over the last 30, 40 years, this is the fruit. This is what we have produced. And I don't know what it's going to take for the church to wake up and realize that it's our failure of discipleship, to use Rosen's language, of cultivating virtue, in this case, Christian virtue, in the people who claim to follow Jesus Christ. That's what's causing the downfall of this republic.
Oh, it's even less justifiable because very few pastors truly, really could lose their job by standing up against an angry fringe. But it's unpleasant. It's hard.
Right.
It's difficult, right? And so they don't want that unpleasantness. They don't want that difficulty. And, look, from a human standpoint, part of me gets this. Like, I've been through the attacks and the online mobbing and everything, and there's nothing pleasant about it. But at the end of the day, if you can't, the apostles withstood beatings to build the church, and we have people who can't withstand tweetings. to sustain the church. And, I'll give you a perfect example. Like when I was invited to speak on a panel at the PCA General Assembly about polarization, I warned them. I said, you're going to get blowback for inviting me. I just, look, it's going to happen. It's going to happen. And I remember talking to one of the senior PCA guys and talking about the blowback that was coming. And they laughed it off like, yeah, whatever. And then it came and the capitulation was instantaneous. I mean, like so fast, so fast. And, look, it's one thing to think in your mind, what will it be like when all these nasty people tweet at me? Then all the nasty people tweet at you and you read some nasty articles and it's very painful and you don't like it and you don't want it to happen anymore. And so your immediate thought is like, how can I get them to stop hitting me with this Twitter hammer? And so, and we have seen this again and again and again in religious institutions. You get blowback from the fringe, and it's the, quote, good people that capitulate. It's the good ones. It's the nice ones, Skye. It's the people that if you met and you spent time with them, you would think they've got a heart for the poor and for the gospel and all of this. But man, when it comes to actually standing up for justice, when there's difficult confrontation inside the church, many of them are just nowhere to be found, the nice ones. And this is how injustice perpetuates. This is how abuse perpetuates, because there's always an excuse for the nice person to kind of bow out, to try to soothe over the feelings, to try to get past the conflict. And, I am all for peacemaking, but we are also called to act justly.
Yeah.
And if peace comes at the expense of justice, it's a false peace.
Right. I call it peace faking instead of peacemaking.
Right.
Yeah. We gloss over the abuse, the injustice, the failure of character, whatever it might be, in order to just not rock the boat. And we say we're doing it for peace, or we're doing it for unity. That's another big one.
Yeah.
Like we don't want to cause disunity in the church or in the body or whatever. And I've talked to pastors who, and this is before Trump, long before Trump, and there's a dramatic issue directly impacting their community, their city, their neighborhoods, their families. They can acknowledge it. They see the biblical implications of it. And then I asked them, this was when I was working for Christianity Today and doing some interviews around the country. I'd ask them, okay, well, what are you preaching or saying in your church about this issue? And they're like, oh, no, I can't talk about it because it's interpreted as political. I'm like, you just told me how it's hurting people in your community, including families in your church. You've given me the biblical precedent for dealing with this thing, and you won't talk about it? And the answer comes back, well, if I talk about it, it's going to upset people. I'm going to lose people. It'll decline the giving, and it'll impede our ability to advance the gospel, which is our primary mission. And I'm like, really? I just see that as pastoral malpractice. And it's all for the sake of peace.
That's always the excuse.
Right.
It's always the excuse. Like we're advancing the gospel. We can't have real full accountability for the large scale systemic sexual abuse of boys at this camp. Look at how many people have come to Christ. We can't take a good hard look at the allegations, meritorious allegations made by a woman about the number one Christian apologist in America. He's out there talking about Jesus in Saudi Arabia. It's just too important to derail. You just get this all the time. Every institution. Well, look at all the good that we're doing or that we're supposed to be doing. And if we really turn this place inside out, if we really hold people accountable, we can't do that good anymore. And it's this constant drumbeat of ends justify the means. So there's no wonder that people were ready and willing and happy to hear an ends justifies the means argument about political figures if they've been living in that world for their whole lives sometimes in the church.
So one of the questions coming all the way back around circle to Donald Trump and his policies, domestic and foreign, do you think there's a tipping point at which his breaking of norms, his violations of international treaties, on and on, it becomes so high that enough Christians can no longer justify the ends, justifying the means? Like, at what point do they, here's arguments I've heard. Yeah. We know Trump is a brute and he's terrible and he says awful things about various people. But if he wasn't in office, we'd have, you pick your boogeyman, right? Transgender ideology in our schools, or we would have, trans girls in sports, or we would have open borders and we'd be run over by immigrants and our economy can't sustain. So it's better than the alternative. Is there any point at which Trump's abuses and failures and siding with our enemies becomes so undeniably awful that you think it tips the scale and enough people go, no, this doesn't justify anything?
I mean, it's absolutely the case that he can be so bad and incompetent that it tips the scales to where he's not politically as viable. I mean, we saw that in 2020. I mean, in 2020, he ran a race where there was an enormous amount of chaos. There was an enormous amount of disruption. He was increasingly unhinged, and he lost. And he didn't just lose in Electoral College. He lost the popular vote by about 7 million people. So we do know that there is a tipping point where at least some segment of people will jump off the Trump train. But Skye, when it comes to that white evangelical core, I don't know how many of those folks are willing to jump off at any point, at any time ever, because there's a factor that we haven't talked about yet that is just looming out there, just massively. We forget how many people are supporting Trump out of conviction that he has been prophesied to be God's man, and that nothing about all of his norm breaking or et cetera does anything but reaffirm the core element of the prophecy, which is Trump using an unlikely person to preserve his people. And so we have to realize that, especially when it comes to a giant number of Pentecostal Americans, they're not in a world right now where it's really truly a policy argument more than it's, say, a prophecy argument. And that's a hard argument to have. And you know, and I've told this story before, you know, a friend of mine from law school said to me, David, I was totally with you on being never Trump until the Holy Spirit told me that Trump is God's man to save America. How do you have a conversation about that, Skye? This is where the fanaticism around Trump is tipping over into something truly spooky. Is this level of this sort of world of prophecy, a world where Trump is seen as having a particular divinely anointed purpose, so that even if you're opposing Trump, you're opposing God even. And so that's where I get really pessimistic. I do think there's some percentage of people who could peel off, but the big bulk, many of them in the Christian world, to an extent that would sort of maybe shock a lot of your more secular listeners, many people in the Christian world are operating under an assumption that Trump has been prophesied to be in this position. And that's a tough argument to have.
I was listening to the Ezra Klein podcast a couple days ago, and he had a guest on recently named Martin Gurry, if you've heard that or listened to it, former CIA analyst. And he did not vote for Trump in 16 or 20, but he did vote for Trump in 24. And Klein was asking him, like, explain to me why you're on the Trump train now. And he's not a full-throated like MAGA endorser or anything, but he's hopeful that Donald Trump can do more good than harm. But he talked, and I have no idea what his faith is, if he has a Christian faith or anything like that, I don't know. But he talked about a pivotal turning point for him was the assassination attempt in Philadelphia last summer, where the scene of Trump, and he's from Cuba originally, and he talked about how when and you've been in combat, when there's bullets whizzing by, all the talk becomes very cheap, right? All the rhetoric about bravery and strength becomes really cheap. But his sense was that here's Trump, hits the ground after a bullet grazes his ear. He's surrounded by the Secret Service, and he has the wherewithal to stand up, ask for his shoes, pump his fist in the air and yell, fight, 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 in defiance with that flag behind him. And he talked about it as if it was a providential, divinely orchestrated moment. And it was almost like, how can you deny this guy? Because of his courage and his strength and his clarity of mind in that moment of chaos. He didn't cower and flee like most people would. And the whole moment seemed like it was out of a script. It couldn't have been more perfect. And I get it. A lot of Christians look at that and go, yeah, God's with this guy, clearly. And so then
I saw that all over social media.
And I understand the impulse to want to believe that. But then you look at what he actually does. And this is the part I struggle with, is we get so caught up in spectacular things as evidence of God's presence or blessing. And yet what we're told throughout the Gospels and the New Testament is that the way you actually know where someone is by their fruit. And the fruit that's defined, and when Jesus talks about this in the Sermon on the Mount, he's not talking about miracles or spectacular events or power, because in the verses immediately after, you will know a tree by its fruit, he rejects people who come to him on the day of judgment who've performed miracles and done spectacular things. The fruit he's talking about is the stuff he's been outlining throughout the Sermon on the Mount. It's not being governed by lust. It's being generous. It's loving your enemies. It's not being consumed by fear. It's not using power over. It's love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness. It's the fruit of the Spirit. And so when I look at Donald Trump and wanting to know, is this a man aligned with God and his kingdom? I'm looking for evidence of the fruit of the Spirit. And I don't think that's what most people are looking for anymore. They're looking at, wow, he stood up in defiance in this picturesque moment in front of a flag, and they think that's proof that God's with him.
Well, that goes back to the character formation point.
Exactly.
By their fruits you shall know them. What are the fruits that we're supposed to look at? You just defined them very well. But look, if you're going to go by like spectacular near misses as evidence of divine favor, well, there's lots of horrible people throughout history who've had spectacular near misses in combat or assassination attempts or whatever. Like, that is not something that is unusual in world history. This is something. So ascribing providential meaning to unusual events it's a version of what I've started to think about. There is such a thing as Christian superstition.
Oh, big time. Yeah.
Big time. And so this is the kind of thing when you start to overread ordinary events, overread even significant events, ascribing an enormous amount of known providential meaning behind events that happen in the world, when often spectacular, crazy events happen in the world, and we don't know the mind of God around it at all, not at all. But this Christian superstition sort of says, "Oh, I can divine the divine. I can figure out the divine import behind A or B or C, or I can see divine import behind A, B, or C." And a lot of that is just nothing more than a concoction of our own head, our own wishful thinking, our own desires. But you see it all over the place. And I'm somebody who firmly believes that the spiritual world is real. I believe that miracles exist. I believe in all of that. But I also understand that you have to mediate everything through Scripture. And if I am seeing somebody as selected, if my one interpretation is they're selected by God for a great and wonderful purpose, but then when I examine them and their fruit is horrific, well, then I need to question that prophecy that said he's selected by God in light of Scripture, which helps us define what virtue actually is.
Amen. Well, I guess we should leave it at that. We'll post this article by Jonathan Rouch about how to understand the way Trump operates. And I am in the process of reading both Rouch's book and the Rosen book about the pursuit of happiness. And maybe we'll do a future episode unpacking more of what's in there. But it's just a good reminder that you've been saying this from the get-go, David. Character counts. Character matters. Character is destiny. Pick whatever cliche you want. And I think I just, especially in the Ukraine example, millions of people's lives and well-being hinge on the character of our president. And it's not looking good for them, or for those who are affected by the cutting of U.S. foreign aid, or for the asylum seekers, the refugees that the U.S. had promised could enter and they would find safety here that we have rejected and turned back to possible persecution or death in their home countries. Like, character in that office matters immensely. And as our founders warned, if we don't have women and men of character, both in political office and in the ballot booth, we're doomed. So there's a happy note to end on.
Yeah, it's so up with people. Well, hey, Skye, here's a happy note. Severance 2 so far, Severance season 2, incredible television.
I know, I'm still in season 1. I got to get caught up, but I look forward to getting caught up, and we'll do another nerd podcast episode where we can geek out about some of that stuff. And we're going to go see this Superman movie together this summer in some way.
Oh, IMAX, but the condition IMAX only or
IMAX only. IMAX only.
Yes.
Either here in
Okay.
Chicago or down in Nashville, whatever I have to do, we'll figure this out. But
let's do it.
all right. So maybe after that, we'll do our episode on lighter things.
Give the people what they want, and they want us to spend an hour on Superman.
I
There's
think
no
so.
question about
I
that.
think so. David, thank you so much. Appreciate your time every month, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks so much, Skye.
French Friday is a production of Holy Post Media, featuring David French and me, Skye Jethani. Music and theme song by Phil Vischer. This show is made possible by Holy Post patrons. To find out how you can become a Holy Post patron and to find more common good Christian content, go to holypost.com.